IVM.
All cultures claim a special love for food, and Indians are no different. Today we know more about what lies beneath some of the magic and the wonder of cooking, how the chemistry and the science of food really works. But until now, I would be hard-pressed to recommend any reading on the science and engineering of Indian food. Krish Ashok, the author of Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking, is changing all of this. He joins me on this episode to give us a behind-the-scenes peek at the magic of Indian food. We recorded this episode back in the end of October, and I wish I was able to share this episode and resume the Pragati Podcast sooner. But we are finally back, and dear listeners, thank you for continuing to listen and subscribe to the show. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great, awesome, amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsor on the network this week, Storytel and the Whole Truth Foods. We have a new show out this week, Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan. Sid K is a well-known RJ. He has an incredible show with some of the most amazing Bollywood celebrities. As part of the first week's episode, we're releasing 5 episodes at one time, so you can get your fill of Sid. You can hear him talk to Varun Dhawan, Anil Kapoor, Anurag Kashyap, Bhumi Pednekar, and a whole lot more. This week on the Edges and Sledges podcast with Varun DJ and Ashwin, hear them talk about the historic victory that India achieved at Gaba. Maruk Inayat had an amazing talk with Gul Panag. They spoke about the farmer protests and why Bollywood celebs are acting the way that they are. And finally, Shunya 1 is back this week. Shiladitya and me talked to Anirudh Singla from Pepper Content. We have a great lineup of guests coming up in the coming weeks, including Deepak Abbott, the co-founder of India Gold. Definitely check that out. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi Ashok, welcome to the Pragati Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Pavan. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So, Ashok, the Pragati Podcast is primarily a policy and public affairs and economics podcast, right? But I also really feel that I want this to be a space where we can better inform people on good science in general and sort of good evidence-based knowledge in general across fields, and also to demystify topics, to bust myths and deepen our thinking in general, right? Especially on all things India. And in that spirit, I just love your new book, Masala Lab, and how you have sort of brought in principles of modern science and just tried to demystify and explain the madness and the wonder that is Indian cooking. And it is truly mad and wondrous, right? The kinds of things we do with our spices, to our fermentation, to everything. The biophysical chemistry of food is just incredible.
It is. In some sense, while you say, it's a podcast about policy and public affairs and so on, I do think cooking, is rather directly impacts a lot of that, in the sense that, we all have to eat 3 times a day. And the decisions we make in our kitchens in terms of how we source food, how we reduce wastage, and more importantly, how we don't fall for the pseudoscience, universe that exists at the intersection of nutrition and cooking, right? Thanks to WhatsApp and others. I think it's important that people understand what goes into cooking, what is it that you're eating. And I think, and if you're healthy and if you are being sensible about how you cook, I think that does have a positive impact on society overall.
Absolutely. But sometimes these sort of policy conversations on food end up revolving around either sustainability or about nutrition, right? I mean, those are the 2 big elephants in the room. And I think we are by and large going to avoid both those elephants in our conversation today, right? I mean, that's
Absolutely.
best left for other conversations and other discussions. And I think there's a lot more fun that gets lost in the process of hunting for nutrition or hunting for, sustainability, both of which might be, extremely important. So, first off, Ashok, so you're an engineer by training, but you're very much also a Renaissance man. You make fantastic music. You have been one of the funniest bloggers out of India for quite a while now. And now you've been into cooking very publicly on Twitter and elsewhere as well for quite a while. And now the book. So what prompted you to not just get into cooking, but the science and the mechanics of cooking?
So the arc of how all of this kind of came together is, since you mentioned my early days as a blogger and so on, right? So if you really think about the kinds of things that I was blogging about, it's usually the intersection of society from the context of, the tension between conservative values in the family and liberal and progressive values, and also very closely related science and pseudoscience, right?
Right. And the absurdities that are there,
and the absurdities
the
that exist, right? Across the spectrum, right? So that's how this whole thing kind of began. And amidst all of this, I was always cooking, right? So cooking is something that I've loved for a long while. I learned to cook, the first time I went abroad, and I made sure I visited a lot of my grandaunts and grandmother and mother and everyone, and recorded and wrote down recipes of all the things that they used to make. And then, and then I started exploring. And over the last 15, 16 years, kind of learned a lot of these heuristics, if you will, of optimizing and really making sense of what works and what does not work through the lens of science. So along this journey, it's been this case where I used to blog, and then I started writing columns for newspapers. Again, those columns were also, again, at the intersection of science, pseudoscience, explaining science and so on. So for me, explaining science to people has always been something that I absolutely love doing. If I wasn't in IT, maybe at some point of time, I'd love to become a physics or a chemistry teacher for high school, because I think, even within the family and friends, explaining things to people they explain like I'm 5, right? So in the sense of explaining things, really dumbing it down to the point where somebody gets it, is something that I've always enjoyed doing, right? So even back in school, fortunately, I was in a school that used to have this habit of, taking students who are struggling to understand science or mathematics at a certain level, because sometimes that happens in class 8 or 9, and then pairing them up with kids who kind of get it, and then saying, can you guys kind of mentor them? And I absolutely used to love that. I love this idea of taking somebody who doesn't get it and then really progressively simplifying it down to the fact till you get it, right? Be it mathematics, be it science, and so on. So I've always loved doing that, right? So that's what I used to sort of do in my writing in columns and all of that. And so when the pandemic hit, I just saw the fact that a tremendous number of people were learning to cook, realizing that ordering every day from Swiggy is not just sustainable, also unhealthy on the longer run and so on. So people were learning to cook. And at the same time, there's this interesting phenomenon. So I like to think of period before the internet, right? This might be a delusion, and perhaps we could disagree on this. I think people were slightly better informed by not being informed, as opposed to the internet era, where there is just, you are less informed by being over-informed, right? In the sense that if somebody wanted to learn cooking today, you're just looking at a million recipes, a million bits of pseudoscience, this mixing of nutrition and cooking, which again, the problem with nutrition is the fact that it is highly personalized, right? What works for some people or some individuals does not work for everyone, right?
Right. And the long-term effects of any kind of nutrition is basically unknown. I mean, long-term health, exercise regularly, don't overindulge in red meats or alcohol, or don't smoke, and eat green leafy vegetables. I mean, beyond that, there's nothing really in nutrition science that tells us what can help in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting you mentioned this, right? So there was this fascinating conversation I heard a while back, and somebody just observed that why is it that there is a new fad diet book every year, right? The reason there's a fad diet book every year, because the science is never settled, right? So there is still space for people who want information, and somebody is willing to give them half-baked information every year, right?
Right.
Without little or no scientific backing.
And we see this happening with, like, coconut oil is good one year, it's bad the next year. But it's not about good or bad, it's about what context and how you're using it and how much, right? And everything gets lost in that process.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we grew up at a time in the 80s and 90s when fats were demonized, not carbohydrates.
Right.
And so we still find a cooking culture where I still get WhatsApp forwards about using less oil. And like, people are missing the elephant in the room. Boss, you need to be reducing. Old people who were 40s 20 years ago and now in their 60s and now suddenly worried about the health of their heart and many other things will say, oh, I need to reduce my ghee consumption. Boss, you're eating 1 teaspoon. Okay. You don't need to reduce that. But you're eating that same mountain of rice that you were eating. That's where the problem is and so on, right? So kind of getting back to the whole introduction thing, right? So one is that there's this huge ocean of misinformation. And I think we have done ourselves a tremendous disservice by treating Indian cooking as some kind of, mystical Oriental art that, you have this natural skill and ability and so on. and not really try to standardize it, come up with some standard basic methods, which you can then mix and match in the context of really making anything, right? So that I think is something that I set out to do in this book, to say that can I capture some basics in terms of how does heat work? What are the basic reactions that you need to understand? And not at the chemical level, but in the level of what happens when you do this. How do you deal with spices? How do you deal with meat? How do you deal with rice or wheat and so on, as a set of building blocks? And then once you go see a recipe, you read a ton of cookbooks, you read it very differently, right? Because then you're not worried about the minutiae of all the proportions and, buy this step and do this before that. You're kind of better informed, and you kind of treat that more as a suggestion more than a, precise set of instructions that you have to follow, like a, manufacturing thing.
And, I love this because the other challenge that I see is traditionally people have learned from their mothers or grandmothers, right, when it comes to cooking. And going abroad is usually one of the triggers for learning cooking. And then there are all these Skype conversations that people would have had with their mothers, and, probably driven others to exasperation in explaining why does this ratio work that way, or, something else. And I'm also really, really curious to learn from our listeners here as to who they learned cooking from, right? And how. Was it from a cookbook? Was it from YouTube? Was it from, your mother or grandmother, or in the rare case, maybe a male member of the household, right? Which unfortunately is still staggeringly small in number. So Ashok, then what I also really liked about your book is that now I'm someone who has some amount of background in biology and chemistry. It's what I studied in college, and I still like it even though I've moved far away from it. But while I understood the chemistry, the word that you mentioned earlier about cooking, heuristics, right? A lot of cooking is about heuristics. It's about these systems that we've sort of figured out by trial and error. There are a few empirics, a few ratios, a few shibboleths, other things that go into what makes a dish good, right? And that's still very different from, say, the practice of, say, chemistry research, which is a very formula driven, follow the steps accurately and you get your end result and you sort of know what's happening. So I like that your book bridges these two worlds and sort of sheds light on why these heuristics are important and make sense, and also, what the hell is actually happening, what the science is. So there's also this very popular Netflix show called Salt, Acid, Fat, Heat, right? Do you think that these four things sort of capture the core essence of cooking?
Very much. Actually, I'm a huge fan of Samin Nosrat, right? I think she's a fantastic cook, and more importantly, she's a fantastic explainer of things. And I think the book is a fantastic distillation, if you will, of, in some sense, the simplest things that you can understand. Just these four things will make you a pretty decent cook. In fact, to be honest, when I started writing the book, it was a little bit after I had actually read Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And my mind immediately went to thinking, you know what, is there something that I could do similar for, Indian cooking in the sense? Clearly, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat is targeted at a slightly more global audience. And if I might say, largely at a Western audience, right?
Right.
And so, yes, those four things kind of get to the crux of most things, techniques of cooking that are applicable to dishes in the West, European and those kinds of cooking. And I felt that I think Indian cooking and other parts of, Southeast Asia, Asian cooking and so on, I think deserve a slightly more elaborate list of individual components beyond just these four, right? So which is why my thought process was saying there is heat, there is spice, there is your Maillard reaction, there is, flavors, aroma, and so on. And the different elements that I arrange as there's, 6 or 7 chapters in the book, these as being the sort of equivalent, if you will, of the salt, fat, acid, heat. Salt, in fact, is included in the larger chapter on, aroma and flavor, right? And so on. So absolutely, I think it's a fantastic book for someone to start with. And I think I see this as a book that you might read after you read that book, so to expand your sort of heuristics to Indian cooking specifically.
So Ashok, then what do you think makes Indian cuisine or Indian cooking Indian cooking? Right? Now, again, India is a gigantic, it's a subcontinent. You have everything from the sambar to the tunde kebab and the tangdi chicken. And what do you think are the guiding principles or ideas that sort of define Indian cuisine as a whole? I mean, the exceptions might be more than the rules, perhaps, in the sub-cuisine cultures and so on. But is there something general? Because if I imagine, say, Japanese food, I feel like one of the clear emphasis there is on the purity of the ingredient and about maximizing the core flavor of that ingredient, right? I mean, if you are dealing with fatty tuna, otoro, you want to maximize that flavor and retain its purity. Whereas ours seems to be very different, right? We want to throw 15 different spices, do something mad. There might be some beans or carrot in there, but I don't know if its flavor is there in the final dish. And, French cuisine is its own beast with all kinds of liquids and, concoctions, right? So where does Indian cooking come in then?
India by itself, in terms of just sheer culinary variations, is probably more diverse than even Europe, right? With each of, and by the way, one would look at Europe and think that, there are so many different cuisines like French, and nobody would say French cuisine is similar to Italian cuisine and so on. But people have a tendency to kind of consider everything India as being Indian cuisine. Within the sheer stunning variations, and in fact, in one of the chapters, I kind of talk about this, right? Which is to say that you need to approach Indian cooking from the point of view of the kind of dish you're trying to make, and then kind of see what kind of patterns emerge. There's no single way to describe all of the cuisine, right? And if you do that, one category of dishes that you should entirely ignore are starters and snack items, because that is a universe within a universe, right? I think that is just stunning. The range of street foods and sweets and all of that, right? So then if you stick yourself to your typical main courses, then you basically have some patterns emerging, right? So you have rice-based dishes and you have like wheat-based breads, if you will. Then you have your gravies, then you have dry dishes, and you have your chutneys, which is another universe by itself, chutneys, raitas, and so on. And then obviously a slightly less represented group of things, which is your salad, which is not that popular in this part of the world. Obviously, again, there is an urban bias here because, urban places in India don't get fresh ingredients like rural places do. And so we have a tendency to overcook everything. So there is that. So salads are not very popular there. So if you look within these kinds of things, some patterns emerge, right? So if you look at gravies themselves, right, you kind of know that there is so since it's interesting to mention Japanese cuisine, right? So one key difference between Japanese cuisine and cuisines from, say, this part of the world, including the Middle East as well as Iran and other places, is the Japanese cuisine is centered on umami as a flavor. Umami is the flavor that basically is a sort of meaty, savory flavor for which we have taste buds. And the interesting thing is that umami actually amplifies other flavors. So that's the property of umami. It makes other flavors linger for longer, right? So it makes a salty thing saltier. It makes a sweeter thing sweeter. It takes sourness and sort of extends it. So it has a more lingering sort of feeling. It coats your mouth for a longer time. So you get that feeling when you have a ramen, right? You kind of feel that ramen for a longer time, right? So because of that nature of umami that comes from the presence of glutamates and other things, in your food and so on, right? So it is centered around umami. And because it is centered around umami, everything else follows from that, right? If it's centered around umami, you don't need to add as much salt. You don't need to make it as sweet as you need to do, right? So Japanese desserts are less sweeter than desserts in other parts of the world. You don't need to add as much spice and other aromatic ingredients as other cuisines do, because a little will go a long way, right? So there's a umami-centric cuisine. India is actually a fat-centric cuisine.
Okay.
Fat-centric cuisine in the sense that almost every dish, a main course dish, will begin with spices added to fat. That's how you start.
So this can be a tadka, it can be anything.
Yeah, so the tadka that you do at the end is one thing, but most dishes start with tadka at the start as well, right? So either you're going to add oil, you're going to add some whole spices, mustard, jeera, whatever it is. You're going to add onions, you're going to add curry leaves, and it may vary based on, if you're a Jain, you won't add onion, garlic, and all that, but you'll add asafoetida, you'll add a bunch of other things, you'll add tomatoes and so on. Depending on which part of India, the fat may vary. If you're Bengal, you're going to start with mustard oil, then you're going to add panchforan. If it's South India, if it's Tamil Nadu, it's sesame oil, and you're going to add fennel and mustard and curry leaves. It's Kerala, it'll be coconut oil and so on. So the fat may vary and the spices may vary, but essence, the basic idea is that your fat is what transports the primary flavor, right? So it is just that spice flavor molecules dissolve only in fat. They're not water soluble, right? So it's just that once you add water, right, what you're actually doing is increasing the volume of the dish and kind of bringing everything together. You're not actually improving the flavor of anything. At that point, you're actually losing flavor. So in that sense, I would say that, obviously this one pattern is the fact that it's a very fat-centric cuisine. So you're almost always thinking of how to extract flavors from spices or vegetables or anything else that you use into the fat, and then use that to coat any other carbohydrates and proteins. That is part of your core thing. We're not interested in the flavor of the the carbohydrate. We're not interested in the intrinsic flavor of the carrot or the intrinsic flavor of the chana.
And when we are, it's an exception.
It's an exception. Minimalist cooking. I mean, villages often will have, sometimes I like to watch these village grandmothers cook. So there's fantastic YouTube channels. There's 102-year-old lady in Andhra, Mastanamma. I mean, she's one of my favorite go-to channels for rural Andhra cooking, right?
Okay.
Very minimalist, very few ingredients. And she wants to highlight. But even that, if you notice, is almost always centered around extracting those flavors into fat and highlighting them. That's basically the central principle, if you will, right? So one thing that ties together many things within the subcontinental cooking.
So that's interesting. So while we think of Indian cuisine and immediately think of spices and masalas, it's the fat that makes it carry to our mouth, right? So it's, if you have the printing press, you need the paper. So if you have the masala, you need the fat.
Absolutely. So let me take this very simple example, right? If you're having ginger tea, right? So you're going to add, have you noticed how much ginger they boil, with the water?
Yeah.
Right, to make ginger tea. If you add that amount of ginger to a regular dish, you would be overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because you're going to add oil.
Right.
On the other hand, when you're making tea, it's water. So what's going to happen is that most of that ginger flavor is just dissipating into the air. That's what's happening. Or just getting filtered out and so on. Very little bit is going to get into your water. But that's what you want. You don't want it to overpower you. Ginger is a very strong spice, if you will, right? But on the other hand, you can try this experiment. If you boil the ginger with the milk,
okay,
it's going to be tremendously stronger because milk has fats.
Right.
Milk is 88% water, but the rest of it is mostly fat and protein. A lot of these flavors are going to dissolve in the milk fat. Right?
Okay.
So in the sense that it is fat that transports flavor. So the other important thing to remember is the distinction between flavor and taste. It might seem semantic, but it's one of my goals is also to ultimately create some standard vocabulary so that people can describe what they're doing more accurately, right? With a fidelity that someone else can understand, right? Yeah, sometimes recipe writers tend to say things like, cook the tamarind till the raw smell is gone. I mean, what the hell is the raw smell of tamarind, right? How do you describe something that in writing? In some sense, what you're actually wanting to communicate is that you want to cook the tamarind till the sourness goes down to an acceptable level, right? A more scientific way to say is that cook the tamarind till the pH increases.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to do because raw tamarind is very low pH and very, very sour. So that's what you're trying to do. So the interesting aspect here is that spices, for most part, are about aroma, not about taste. Okay? So the reason I want people to distinguish between aroma and taste is that taste is what happens on your tongue. Aroma is what is detected by your nose. Flavor is a combination of aroma and taste. It's what your brain ultimately perceives as a combinatorial thing. And by the way, it also includes sight, visual, the sight of food. If your food does not look appetizing, it will not taste as good. And it also has many other factors. The sound, right? If a crisp potato chip and a not crisp potato chip are chemically the same, but if you don't hear that crunch, it doesn't taste very good, right? So there is sound also plays a role in the perception of flavor, right? And memories play a role in the perception of flavor, which is why familiar smells, if you remember smelling it because your mother and grandmother cooked it, that will naturally taste better than something that is new and foreign and so on. So there is a lot of that. But the elephants in the room are actually smell. Smell is 80% of flavor perception is smell, right? Which is why, because of the times that we live in, people who have COVID-19 and develop anosmia, which is the inability to smell, it is terrible because food will taste bad, right? So if you have a cold, food will taste terrible because you're only tasting it and you're not smelling it, right? And you can only taste 5 things: salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami, right?
But the other interesting thing that you also highlight in your book is how it's not just the taste on the tongue, but that mouth feel, right? Whether something's gummy, sticky, crunchy, and how basically that food interacts with the surface of your tongue and your mouth. That provides a lot of the haptic feedback, if you put inside the mouth,
in a
much more rich way.
Yeah. So in fact, I forgot. So mouthfeel is a tremendous, in fact, I would probably say that that's the third most important component after, say, aroma. Then you have your taste, the 5 tastes, and then the mouthfeel, right? So, and there are like 14 or 15 different kinds of textures that your mouth can detect, right? Everything from gumminess, hardness to, sort of unctuousness and so on, right? So aroma is fascinating because they only come if the actual volatile molecules kind of hit your nose, right? And they do it 2 ways, right? One is that you're smelling it once before you eat the food, or when you take the food close to yourself. the aroma molecules are going to go through your nose and then hit those receptors in your nose.
Right.
But that's, again, very small portion of how you smell food. The real experience comes once you gnash your teeth and bite into food, right? That's when all your fats into which all these aroma molecules are dissolved are starting to get broken down by the enzymes that are there in your saliva, right? At that point, the fats are going to give up those dissolved molecules, which will then travel into your nasal cavity as you breathe out. So as you breathe out, those molecules will hit those receptors. And that actually is the single biggest experience of taste. It's called retronasal olfaction, right? So which is what you smell when you actually breathe out and as while you're eating and so on. So that is actually quite fascinating because, many things that smell very bad on the outside can sometimes be delicious. So fish is an example. Cheese is another example, right? These are acquired smells because what you smell on the way in is very different from what you actually smell once you actually bite into it.
Thanks, Ashok. And I couldn't agree more. And I loved sort of learning so much of this in so many parts of the book. And like you said, I think it sort of helps us unpack and understand our daily experience, right? I mean, every time we bite into a potato chip or anything else, I mean, there's so much that's happening. And there's so much that our body already knows. I mean, like it's reacting to it. But to be cognizant of what's happening, what makes it even more special, right? It doesn't rob any of the beauty of it. Like, I rail against people who say that, Newton ruined the beauty of the rainbow because he could explain that, there was this dispersion that happened. No, it was a new lens of looking at that same beauty and it only added to it.
Yeah. There's a funny thing. You mentioned Newton, right? So there's a funny small little aside that I want to mention, right? The interesting story, right? So there is no reason for the rainbow to have 7 colors. It is a spectrum.
Right.
So we kind of like discretizing things. And incidentally, before Newton came along, we used to see 4 colors in the rainbow, right? Something that is broadly reddish, broadly blue-violetish, broadly, right? So we didn't really distinguish between orange and red, for example, right? In fact, the color of oranges weren't known till, oranges from India actually went to Europe, by the way. So it's the orange that comes from narangi, naranja. The word also comes from that. The color of the fruit is what ultimately, gives the name of the color, right? So Newton, who was a deeply spiritual and outside of his fantastic, achievements in physics, was a complete kook when it came to alchemy and a bunch of other crazy things that he did. He decided that the rainbow has to have a mystical number. Okay? And 7 was a mystical number. So he said, no, I'm going to introduce indigo. I'm going to introduce orange. I'm going to introduce all these other things, which otherwise weren't originally part of how people saw a rainbow. People used to think there were 4 colors in the rainbow. And Newton said, no, there are 7 colors in the rainbow. It's a completely arbitrary distinction, by the way.
Yeah. And usually when you see it, you can only make out 3 or 4 and 7 is always... It feels quite artificial as well. So Ashok, so you sort of gave us this preface on sort of what makes Indian cooking unique, right? Or what is one of its defining characteristics. Then what about the Indian palate then? Is there anything, like one thing you touch upon in your book is salt and how the Indian expectation for the base amount of saltiness is actually much higher than the global average. Are there other things like that make the Indian palate the Indian palate? Now, of course, there's still a variation, and not all of this is genetic, right? Maybe there is some part which might be, but a lot of it would be habit and culture.
It is, absolutely. It is, in fact, even in the context of salt, there are changes happening in the West as well as a result of, shall we say, more snacking, if you will. I think in the sense that there's been, so people used to eat more regular meals that were significantly less on salt as the primary form of eating. And that is shifting towards continuous snacking, right? Even in places like the US. And snacks are generally very sweet and very salt. It's just the way they are in order to make them addictive. So in some sense, these changes are happening there as well. But if you just consider the general preference for my regular sort of meal, right? The Indian palate expects slightly more salt than Westerners, right? Or for that matter, Japanese or anywhere else as well. And this again is not due to genetics. It's just simply because you're used to it, right? So this applies to heat as well. So in addition to salt, there is heat, right? So heat also is not a taste. Heat is a sensation, right? Because there's no taste buds for capsaicin. It's actually just your the nerve endings that are trying to prevent you from eating physically hot food, like high temperature food or highly acidic foods, right? And so again, both of these sensors, the more you have, you kind of get used to it, right? So if you eat very, very salty food, then anything with slightly less salt than that will seem unseasoned, right? So in general, you find Western culinary schools, I sort of looked at a bunch of these, read through a lot of their Culinary Institute of America and all these French gastronomic schools and so on. They want to, turn this down into a science. They kind of say that 1 to 1.5%, 1% in general is a good place to start. 1% meaning the weight of the dish. The weight of the dish, 1% of the weight of the dish has to be salt for it to be reasonably seasoned, right? And there's a little bit of science to that. Our saliva itself is 0.4% salt. Anything less than that will taste unsalted. So at the bare minimum, you need 0.5% in any case, even for people who might be like, heart patients and all that. But you want to kind of between 0.5 to 1 is what they consider to be basic seasoning, right? In India, it's anywhere from 1 to 1.5, sometimes even 2%. Even for our regular meals is what I found. As I was sort of experimenting during this time, I've used my family members as guinea pigs, if you will, on really trying out. Okay, this is 1.5%. Did they say this needs a little bit? Did they quietly go and add more salt themselves, or did they say that this is just way too salty, right? And so put them through this experiment and found that I think in general it's safe to say that we generally need more salt. And if you're cooking Indian food, 1.5% is a good place to start. And then you can adjust up or down based on, especially if you have that salt nervousness. Oh, am I overdoing this and so on?
Right. And that's one of the things you say, right? Salt is the one thing that you cannot take back. Once it's in, it's in.
Yep. You cannot undo salt. All the internet tricks and tons of YouTube videos that have millions of views on they either use boiled potatoes or dough balls or balls of rice. None of that actually works.
So Ashok, let's take a quick break and we'll come back. I want to talk about the heuristics, the grandmotherly wisdom that we see, and how we can understand that better through sort of food science. Before we break, dear listeners, don't forget to listen to this episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your mobile or desktop browsers to get the rich new experience. I would also like to thank the Takshashila Institution and IPSMF, the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, for making the Pragati Podcast possible.
2020 is a difficult year. A global pandemic, protests, elections, recessions. You get the picture. What we need is a space where we can have nuanced discussions about global affairs and foreign policy. That's where I come in. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I host the States of Anarchy podcast. Every second Tuesday, I speak to experts in the field of international relations to make a little more sense of the world. So join me on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you're listening to me right now.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here with Krish Ashok. So Ashok, one of the things that is there in any part of sort of learning cooking is learning from people who've been cooking for not just years but decades, right? And Indian women have been doing that, feeding not 4-5 people, 10, 20 people regularly for eons, and often at great cost to themselves. So there is a lot of wisdom that gets generated and accumulated in that process, right? Because the trial and error has gone on for 5,000 times, 10,000 times. I mean, whether there is good science in that 10,000 hours or not, this is clearly like 40,000 hours or some crazier number behind it, right? Tell us about how science can explain some of the heuristics that people have come up with.
Well, yeah, I think this is a very important. It's a great question because so there is this. Nassim Nicholas Taleb has this. One of the things he talks about, right, is this idea that sometimes we end up dismissing traditional wisdom, things that have stood the test of time, over things that kind of sound scientific, right, but are not really backed by really great, source of data and so on. This is particularly true for cooking, because what has happened is that as a culture, we're not a very documenting type of culture. We've seen that for the last 3,000-4,000 years. Not want to write things down in general. And again, as a result of the fact that a lot of this tacit knowledge has historically resided with women, all the more reason that we've not had an opportunity to write it down, right? Given that they had access to education only in the last 100 years or so. So a lot of this is basically oral transmission, mother to daughter. You kind of learn the general tricks of the trade. And one of the things that happens with traditional knowledge is that it works as a technique in that if you apply it, you will get the outcomes that it predicts you will get. Okay? But where we've often sort of struggled in the modern days is to explain that with some kind of scientific language, and we often do a bad job of it. Right? And then I can't expect my grandmother to explain to me, for example, why she might squeeze a little bit of lime at the end of a dish, or why, for example, a Punjabi grandmother might actually add a tea bag, when you're actually pressure cooking or cooking chole, right? Chana, right? When you're actually cooking the chana, tea bag, right? Or for that matter, why, using a pinch of soda when you're actually making chana will make the chana go really, really soft, right? For example, right? She knows it will work, but she doesn't know it's because sodium bicarbonate is a base and it actually helps break down the pectin in the cell walls of a legume and all of that. So the thing is that this bridge, because we've not really bothered to really document a lot of this, it's just become an ocean of disinformation and an opportunity for people to just make up stuff in the internet era. Right. But a ton of people will simply say that you should do this because, and use some scientific terms. Good example is, people will say that if you chop the ends of a cucumber and then if you rub them together, it will reduce the bitterness. I'm like, how does one small mechanical motion at the end of a cucumber going to change the fundamental chemistry of the entire cucumber? It just doesn't make sense. So I think sometimes if we don't arm ourselves with some of these basic ideas, you won't be able to sort of successfully administer the smell test to many of these kinds of science and pseudoscience, right? So the important thing to understand is that there's a better chance that what your grandmother does has far better backing in science than what you read on the internet. That's for sure. Okay? And so therefore, if you apply some of these understand the basics of heat, understand the basics of these reactions and so on, you can actually explain, you can understand, listen to what she's saying and be able to explain it yourself, right? So let me take the example of the chana and the tea bag, right? So what happens is if you go to North India, what you'll often find is that if you're cooking large amounts of chana, people will put a tiny amount of baking soda, and while they're at it, they'll actually add a tea bag as well. But if you ask people why they do it, they'll say that I'm adding the tea bag because it lends the chana a beautiful dark brown color, which people like. Okay. Which is not a bad reason per se, because by the way, we perceive darker brown foods to be tastier than lighter, paler looking foods because we have an instinctive thing saying, oh, Maillard reaction has happened, that's going to be delicious, even before we eat it, by the way. Okay? Right. So it doesn't have to smell or taste, but just looking at something darker brown will make it taste better than if it was like paler in color. So a darker colored chana will actually taste better than a lighter colored chana, even if everything else was equal, right? So there's a psychological perception to that, right? So now, but the actual reality where they're actually adding the tea bag is that tea is an acid. It's a very mild acid. Now, unlike lime juice or vinegar or something like that. And when you're adding baking soda is a base, right? And bases actually taste bitter. Bases actually taste bad. Acids taste good to us. Bases taste bad. Acids taste sour, right? The Latin word acid actually means sour, right? Bases, on the other hand, taste bitter. So baking soda give you a nasty metallic bitter taste if you actually taste it, right?
And also excessive amounts mean that, the baking soda will react with the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, right?
And then you'll sort of get bloated and you get that feeling in restaurants sometimes, the low-end restaurants, right? So what happens here is the fact that what you don't want is for any of the baking soda to get left over, right? You want it to be used up, right? So in addition to its effect at high temperature when it breaks down the pectin in the cell walls and makes the chana softer or rajma softer, you want any leftover residual baking soda to be neutralized by an acid, right? So base and acid gives you carbon dioxide and water. So you want that to happen, right? So that's why you add the tea bag. Now, again, there's a choice, right? If you add the vinegar or lime juice, right, the acid will instantaneously react and neutralize all the baking soda even before the cooking process happens, right?
Right.
Tea bags, on the other hand, are used because it starts acting only when it is heated at that temperature once mixed with water and so on. So you want that. You want a delayed action, right? So that's why you actually add tea, right?
So that's a fairly complex biophysical reaction happening there.
Exactly, right? And it's just that people have figured this out simply by experimentation over, a long period of time in many kitchens and sort of rules of thumb that you kind of learn. And this is just a classic example of that. I am sure somebody would have used lime juice, used many things, he would have failed at it. And then it's all of this is very, evolutionary in the sense, right? Like literally 1,000 flowers, 1,000, experiments happening in every home. And then over time, the successful ones kind of, succeed, right? So this is an example of how this kind of heuristic really works, right? Then the other one is this idea of this, almost every part of India, for example, has a yogurt-based gravy dish, right? There are many names, right? So kadhi in the west of India, to Mor Kodambu in Tamil Nadu, to Pulisheri in Kerala. I don't know what it's called in Karnataka.
Majjige huli in Kannada.
Majjige huli, yeah. So basically,
essentially more curd.
Any kind of a curd-based gravy. Now, again, we all know that yogurt is actually a very weak emulsion, fat, sugars, and proteins in water, right? And the interesting thing is that this emulsion breaks very quickly if you heat it.
Okay.
So as long as it's at room temperature, it's fine. The moment you heat it, this emulsion will break and you'll get that very crumbly bits. And it's not very appetizing and it doesn't do the role that it's supposed to do to create that mouthfeel that you need in that kind of a dish, right? So obviously what you want to do is you want to strengthen the emulsion. Right? Now, how do you strengthen an emulsion? There are many ways, right? So if you're strengthening the emulsion of, say, a mayonnaise, you typically use mustard, right? So mustard is what strengthens the emulsion between the egg fats and the water, right? And the oil, sorry. The water in the egg, which is 70% water, and the oil, the olive oil or whatever it is you're using to make the mayonnaise, right? In the context of a pulishery or a more kurambu, the emulsifier is usually some kind of starch, right? Either a rice flour or a wheat flour or something else, or a cornstarch or whatever it is. If you whisk the curd with it, that will actually keep the emulsion stronger. Right? So what's actually happening in that case, basically starches, right? So once they dissolve in water, they have these water-friendly ends and they have water-unfriendly ends and so on. So they kind of, the fats end up sticking to the water-unfriendly ends and the water-friendly ones stick to the other ends and so on. So basically what happens is that it strengthens the emulsion, right? So, and this is something that people have naturally known over time without necessarily understanding emulsions and the physics of emulsions and so on. So there are many, many such examples like this if you really look at why people do what they do.
You know, one thing I really liked while reading your book was till the first knuckle of the index finger, the amount of water you need to put over rice when you're cooking rice. So tell us about that, because that can often be in conflict with the advice on do you do 2:1 ratio, 1:1.5, whatever number, right?
You know, this is a classic example of, people observing something that works, but then deriving the wrong reason for why it works, right? In fact, if you ask anyone who's old, grandmothers and so on, they're never going to talk about rice and ratios at all. They're almost always going to talk about the index finger rule. This cup to water ratio is a product of the internet era and cookbooks era, if you will, where people just put these things and people assumed that it will work for everything. So it's important to therefore first understand the fact that most people don't realize that rice actually absorbs its own volume in water, equal parts.
Right.
Almost all varieties of rice, regardless of variety, 1 cup of rice absorbs 1 cup of water. By volume, this is how it works.
Is this the same with a drier, grainier basmati and a mushier sambar rice that we use?
This is the fascinating thing. So there's a I think America's Test Kitchen actually experimented with every variety of rice and said that almost every variety of rice effectively absorbs the same amount of water. Now, again, there's a caveat here. You can get it to absorb more water by adding more water and cooking it for longer and turning it into a complete, like a kanji type of a khichdi type of texture. But every rice absorbs enough water for it to consider to be fully cooked and separate grains. If you want that kind of texture, then they all absorb the same amount of water. Right? Now, so if you have a vessel, you add rice and you add water to exactly the level of the rice, it will essentially absorb all that water. Now, only problem is, as you're cooking, you're going to lose a fair bit of water to evaporation.
Right.
So the rice will not end up having enough water. So historically, what people figured out is that, hey, I need to add a little bit more water to account for evaporation. So that was the original principle behind how we essentially started adding more water to rice. Right.
So then what you're saying is, like, however rice packs and sits in a bowl, you're essentially saying it occupies roughly, say, 50% of the volume or so. So the rest is water. So that's why, or whatever, its density might be a little different.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that if you pack it any further, you're going to break the rice and all of that. And it's possible that, so sometimes you have, like, for example, in bisibele bath, you sometimes use broken rice, right?
Right.
And broken rice obviously occupies much smaller volume and can be packed into. So if you're actually making broken rice and you want to cook it down to exactly that kind of separated texture and all of that, the proportion may vary in that sense. But for most full grain, regular grains of rice, it's largely, and it roughly works. There may be mild variations, but for most part, this works.
Right.
So the whole idea is that you need to add extra water to compensate for evaporation. So therefore, the amount of water you add is not dependent on the amount of rice. That's the first thing. So basically, you have rice. You need to add exactly that amount of water. Then you need to add extra to account for evaporation. That amount you add extra has nothing to do with the amount of rice that's below it. It only has to do with the shape of the vessel and the amount of heat you're applying. So therefore, right, as long as you are in a nuclear sized family using like relatively medium, small sized kind of vessels, it just so happens that a 1:2 or a 1:1.5 ratio is roughly what you need, and it works. Where it does not work is if you need to cook more amounts of rice, it won't work. If you have a party, this is where most people fail, right? If you're a beginner cook, all of a sudden you have some people for a party and you're responsible for boiling the rice. And you're like, oh, a 1:2 ratio, and you have to cook, say 3 cups of rice. Okay, and you put 6 cups of water, you will get khichdi, because that's way too much, right? It actually should be 3 cups plus a little bit enough on top of 3 cups to account for evaporation is what you need to think about, right? So that's where the index, that knuckle thing comes in, because in general, if you had enough water on top of the level of the rice till it comes to the first knuckle of your index finger, it's a safe place to start. Again, people will say, what if my knuckle is small and if I have giant fingers and all of that? All that is fine. But I think over time, you'll kind of adjust and figure out what is the right level that works for you. But thinking about the fact that this is fundamentally about evaporation will make you think differently about this.
So then basically, I guess one of the objectives of your book and this kind of work, one of its biggest utilities would also be that you not only want to explain the heuristics, but you want to see what are the underlying assumptions behind the heuristics, because people who've been cooking before us would have been using certain vessels and certain systems. And if we are now transitioning to a different setup, the underlying assumptions break. The heuristics are still sound. But because we are mucking it up, we think that the knowledge there is bad. Right?
Exactly.
So even if we want to adapt it to a new setup, we just need to know what's happening.
Exactly, right? So that's the whole definition of a heuristic, right? In the sense that it has its own context and you know why it works. And so you are therefore better placed to be able to determine where else it will work and where it will not work. I think my favorite example of a failed heuristic in this context is usually the difference between your gas stoves and your induction stoves, right? Obviously, induction stoves are a lot more common now.
Right.
And induction stoves actually put out a tremendous amount. I mean, in the sense that water boils 30 to 40% faster on an induction stove at peak wattage, right? So at 2000 watts or 1800 watts, it 30-40% faster than at the maximum flame on your gas stove, right? And this actually breaks pressure cooking, right? In the sense that most people use a whistles heuristic for pressure cooking. And that's completely wrong. Whistles work simply because most Indians had the same kind of stuff putting out the same amount of heat. And so the amount of time that the pressure cooker would take between releasing some excess pressure and then heating up again, building enough pressure so that the whistle goes off again, is entirely dependent on the amount of heat you give. And if you're giving 2000 watts of heat on an induction stove, the whistles will come sooner. Right. And you will actually be left with undercooked food.
So you need to wait for more whistles.
Yeah, no, or not measure using whistles at all. That's the point I'm trying to make, which is to say that pressure cooking is dependent on the amount of time something spends at high pressure inside the cooker, right?
Right.
So once the first whistle comes, again, if you watch a lot of older people do this, they know this, right? So they will reduce the pressure. Really seasoned cooks, once the first whistle comes, they will reduce the pressure and then use a rough time estimate. 6 minutes for rice, 6 to 8 minutes for rice, 12 minutes for dal, 15 to 20 minutes for rajma, chana, and so on. 20 minutes for, say, black urad dal, and so on. And that's how you do this, right? So if you're really cooking well, you should never hear more than one whistle. That's the real thing.
So, Ashok, I want to shift gears again from heuristics and talk about the science then, right? Or the chemistry or the physical chemistry of food. So just like we sort of talked about salt, fat, acid, heat at the beginning, you actually identify 4 major sort of physical chemical reactions that happen in all cooking that defines and that makes food palatable for us, right? And you say that these are starch gelatinization, protein denaturation, hydrolysis, and the Maillard reaction. Now, of these, the Maillard reaction, I think, gets the most pop billing, right? I mean, because the idea of something browning, there's a certain natural, I think you can smell it also the moment the onions brown on a pan.
Yes.
It looks cool. Yes. We know that it can taste good because it's sort of like frying. And we know that, certain volatile molecules, some maltoses, some, complex sugars get formed. That's sort of my understanding also. You can go to Wikipedia, you'll find something similar.
Sure.
But tell me about how this becomes a defining reaction, and tell us about the others as well.
So I think let me start with, so first and foremost, right? So it's important to appreciate that philosophically and actually even pretty much scientifically as well, cooking is basically your body outsourcing digestion outside itself. Right? Digestion actually is a very, very energy intensive. In fact, I think it's, single biggest contributor to your aging and eventual death is the fact your digestive system, foundationally, right? I mean, it has to take in stuff and it undergoes a tremendous amount of wear and tear as you do that, right? So I think mankind's most game-changing, discovery in the last 100,000 years would have been the fact that I can pre-digest food before I eat it. So foundationally, cooking is actually pre-digesting. That's really what it is, right? You're taking basic ingredients, carbohydrates of various kinds, easy, sugars, as well as the tougher ones that you find in, say, legumes and grains, and the really impossible to digest ones, his celluloses and the other things that you don't digest, right? At all. They just go right through, right? And then you have your proteins and you have your fats and so on. So basically, the fact that we're actually outsourcing digestion. So important to understand the part is that a lot of the chemistry that happens in the context of cooking, incidentally, also happens inside your body. It just continues, right? So these reactions, some of them happen only outside, and some of them happen both outside and inside. So it's important to understand that, right? So let's sort of start with the reason I picked these four is because I think look at the most common things that you cook, right? 50% of most of your calories will come from carbohydrates in an ideal sense. Although I suspect Indians probably eat way more than 50%.
And vegetarians
particularly eat way more. Yeah. Get too many. Actually, Indian vegetarians have a tendency to think dal is actually like all protein. It's not. Okay, it's more than 50% carbohydrates. So the interesting thing is that carbohydrates, understanding how you cook carbohydrates is basically what starch gelatinization is about. So that's number one. Protein denaturation and hydrolysis are important in the context of meat in general and proteins in general. A lot more for meat as well as eggs, obviously the most common kinds of meat, obviously in the context of, say, paneer and things like that, where, the very act of making paneer is denaturing milk proteins. So that's number one, right? And the last one is obviously Maillard reaction. Very specifically is something that happens. The critical thing to remember is that it happens above the boiling point of water.
Right.
So this is important because we are mostly water. Most things we eat are mostly water and so on. So Maillard reaction is special because you need to get to a point where, at least on the surface, there is no water left. Only then will you be able to get to that reaction because the temperature will never go above 100 as long as there's water around. So that's the important thing about the Maillard reaction. And frying basically is actually just an extreme form of the Maillard reaction, nothing else.
Okay. So Maillard reaction is not just about pan frying your onions and so on. It's most of the browning that we see is Maillard reaction.
Right. So let's start with starch gelatinization and we'll go on the way, right? So starch gelatinization is probably this one chemical reaction that you are most likely to see every day, 3 times a day. Because you're going to cook some kind of starch. It could be potatoes, it could be rice, it could be wheat, it could be anything, right? So again, so to understand this, you have to understand how starch is. Starch is basically sugar molecules that are combined together to form long chains. Right? And so they make up a tremendous amount of plant material is mostly starches. Okay? Different kinds of starches, different kinds of this thing. So some are impossible to digest. The bark of a tree is impossible to digest for us, but it's also carbohydrates in that sense, right? It's just that it's the kind of carbohydrates that some animals like giraffes or cows and goats can digest, but not us. Right? On the other hand, your potatoes and grains, and we humans domesticated these plants because they give you starches that are easy to digest, for starters, right? So what happens when you boil starch in water? Okay? So water is critical because this gelatinization reaction happens only in water. What actually happens is that starch actually is in the form of granules. And there are 2 kinds of starches that we're particularly interested in. These are the most commonly found ones. There are other kinds. Those are the resistant starches that are harder to digest and all of that. And some that are impossible to digest. But the ones that we mostly eat are amylose and amylopectin are the 2 most important kinds of starches. Usually there's more amylopectin, a lot less amylose, but these are the 2 common ones.
And this is across, say, rice and wheat and others.
You take rice, wheat, dal, millets, they all are made up of exactly the same things, amylose, amylopectin, in varying proportions, plus other things that give their characteristic taste and, nutrition and other things. But the starch part of it is the same.
And they're all different sort of polymers of sugars, right? I mean, just like
they are just polymers. They're basically polymers of sugar, sugar molecules, right? Now, in the presence of water and heat, what happens at a certain temperature is that the starch granules start to absorb water and they kind of break. So what happens is that you now get two kinds of textures. So the amylose forms a harder, waxier kind of texture. So best way to taste it is that you bite into a rice grain or you bite into a slightly thick chapati, right? Like a paratha.
Right.
That harder, waxier texture is amylose.
Okay.
Now, amylopectin forms a stickier, gooier sort of texture, which is why rice sticks to each other.
Right. And it's the same thing that comes in the rice congee or ganji, right?
Correct. Yeah, in fact, yeah. So at that point of time, you just have way too much of that. In fact, the reason you wash rice before you boil it is you want to get rid of the surface amylopectin as much as possible, because once it cooks, it's going to get sticky.
Right.
And you want to prevent that.
So you want stickiness within the rice grain. You don't want stickiness between rice grains, ideally.
Yeah, no, stickiness inside the rice grain is unavoidable, but you want to avoid it on the surface at least so that it doesn't stick to other rice grains, right? And the fact, it's the amylose that gives the biteable texture, whereas the amylopectin is just mostly just crumbly or sticky. That's the general texture, right? Now, different varieties of rice will have different amounts of this, right? So your basmati and anything that is high on amylose is more likely to form separated grains. Whereas something that is more on amylopectin is slightly more mushier. So in fact, South Indian varieties of rice tend to be higher on amylopectin. And we like that. We kind of prefer rice that is slightly more sticking to each other. And in fact, people like my mother or grandmother don't like eating the basmati rice because they feel that it is just too grainy and it's too separated. Whereas North Indians prefer rice grains that are very well separated because that's what you need in a pulao or a biryani. Now, whereas when I'm making rice with sambar, I don't necessarily need separate grains. I actually want a more mushier texture in that context. Okay. So basically what's happening is that the starch granules are breaking. The amylose is forming this waxier structure, and now amylopectin has become this gooey, sticky thing. And then what happens is that at some point of time, you're going to stop the heat. Once you stop the heat and the temperature goes down, what will happen is that these granules will now start to do something called retrogradation, which is part of the whole process. So retrogradation essentially means that they will start to form slightly more crystalline structures as these molecules kind of recombine. Now that there's less heat and less energy and all of that, they'll start to form crystalline structures, right? And in fact, that is why when you cook rice, it is important after you cook that you leave it undisturbed for 10 to 15 minutes, because that's when the starch will retrograde.
Right.
And that's when it's at the perfect texture to eat. And by the way, retrogradation is not always a good thing. Chapatis, you don't want that to happen, because that's why you need to heat chapatis hot. Whereas rice, you want to wait 15 minutes and then you can eat it. But chapati has to be, in fact, very, very hot rice is not nice to eat because it's just too sticky. So you want rice to cool down, you want to wait for it starch to retrograde, and that's when rice is ideal to eat. Chapati, on the other hand, when the wheat starches retrograde, they just become really hard and it becomes a dry, papad-like thing, and you don't want that texture, right? So boiled potatoes, after a while get slightly harder and so on, right? So understanding gelatinization is you need to understand both gelatinization and retrogradation, and understand it purely, not in the context of the chemistry, but purely what is actually happening when you cook starch.
Right.
So the moment you cook any starch, this is what's actually happening, and you kind of then have full control over this, and you know what temperature it happens. You kind of know that 70 Celsius is basically when this starts to happen, right?
And this cooked form is the one that is edible, that our stomachs can extract that starch further from, right? I mean, like from saliva downwards, you have a lot of processes that break down starch into sugars, and then they can be absorbed in the small intestine and so on. So you need to do this before you put it in your mouth.
Absolutely. So gelatinized starch is what is easier for our enzymes to break down. In fact, this is a breakthrough invention, if you will, because that hunter-gatherer phase involved us not getting too much carbohydrates as a result, right? You're only eating protein for most part. And this is how the fact that we take grains or dig up tubers, boil them, and then that's all you have to do. And then you suddenly get a ton of calories. I mean, that basically changed civilization, right? So that's why gelatinization is, important in that sense, right? So this is gelatinization. Now, the next, obviously, thing that you need to understand, and by the way, this applies to dal, this applies to rice, this applies to wheat as well, right? Dal also, actually very little of it is actually protein. So although denaturation and all of that happens, they're also irrelevant in the context of dal, because dals are mostly starch. You're primarily cooking the starch.
Right.
And that's when it's ready to eat, right? So the protein denaturation is completely unimportant in the context of dal, vegetarian proteins at least. So protein denaturation is something that needs to be understood as what happens to protein. And typically in the form of eggs, meat, milk, whatever it is. So denaturation essentially means that proteins are actually giant molecules, right? So these are like, they not only have size, they also have configurations in the sense that the actual physical shape and the way they are sort of intertwined amongst themselves performs a certain biological function and so on. So the first thing we are actually doing with denaturing is literally, changing their nature, which is to say that you're kind of breaking that complex structure, three-dimensional structure, and then letting them kind of become more free moving and then free to do other things. Now, what happens, and this varies by what is your source protein. So typically the most common ones that humans tend to consume are muscle tissue, which is there in the flesh of animals, eggs, which is in the albumin and the yolk of the egg, and then milk proteins. These are the three most common families of proteins. So there's only irrelevant. Although there are other kinds of proteins, this is what you normally eat. So in a sense, right? So, and this works differently across each one of them, right? So what happens when you denature meat proteins? Meat proteins means basically muscle tissue, proteins in your muscles, right? What happens is that the proteins in your muscles, then they kind of change their elaborate structure, become a lot more free moving, and as a result, start forming slightly more tighter bonds and become very clumped, right? This is basically the quintessential texture of cooked meat, is rubbery and chewier compared to the soft and moist nature of raw meat, right? The reason for this is the fact that as the proteins denature and form tighter clumps, they lose water. They lose all the moisture that was present inside your muscle tissue when the animal was alive and so on, right? So what happens is that once it loses water, that's where you get a dry texture. And this is very common with, say, chicken breast, which is the world's most regularly overcooked piece of meat because it overcooks very quickly. Okay? And again, it is because the muscle tissue in the breast of the chicken doesn't undergo much exercise, right? And so therefore, it doesn't have much connective tissue, and it's just basically muscle tissue that denatures very quickly at a very low temperature and loses all the water. And it becomes dry and chewy really, really quickly, well before anything else is cooked. Right? So denaturation happens not just with heat, it also happens with acids as well. So marination, for example, adding acids to any kind of meat is actually denaturing at least the surface of the meat. So important thing to remember with denaturation is the fact that it actually happens at a very, very low temperature, and it varies by the kind of animal, right? So which is why steak is often cooked to 52 or 53 Celsius. That's enough. That's all the amount of denaturation.
The inner temperature.
Right, the inner temperature, right, the inside temperature, etc. Like pork around 60 Celsius or so. Chicken alone, we tend to cook to higher temperatures for no reason other than the fact that industrially produced poultry tends to have salmonella. And, well, you don't care about the chewiness, but you don't want to die from salmonella poisoning either. So that's basically why we end up cooking chicken for slightly higher temperatures and so on. And again, what we're trying to say is that if you cook to these temperatures, you will still leave enough moisture inside the texture so that it does not taste dry to you. That's the primary thing. By all means, you can overcook. And by the way, in India, we almost always overcook meat because nobody's taking risks with meat. It's actually quite a fascinating thing, right? So we can actually eat raw meat, right? Because we are animals. Okay? Right. So we, like lions and tigers and everyone else, we are capable of eating raw meat perfectly safely. Raw meat is very safe because a living thing has a vested interest in keeping bacteria and fungi away. So if it's just being killed, it's perfectly safe. Right? On the other hand, industrially produced meat harbors a ton of other things that are actually problematic. So hunter-gatherers actually get healthier meat than actually people who are buying from your regular industrially produced poultry and so on. So protein denaturation essentially is this idea that happens at low temperature. The fascinating thing to remember is that starch is gelatinized at a higher temperature. Incidentally, every vegetable you cook is going through the same reaction, right?
Right.
Vegetables mostly tend to be starches. Some amount of protein, mostly starches, right? So your carrots are also mostly starches, your beetroots are mostly starches, anything, literally any other, even onions for that matter, right? So a fair amount of carbohydrates, sugars are there, addition to the water, right? So what's happening is that you're very, very likely to overcook meat. This is the important thing to understand, especially if you're cooking something together with vegetables and meat. Chances are you're going to overcook the meat. Because for the vegetables to cook, that happens at a higher temperature, which is why you need to understand why starch gelatinization happens at a higher temperature than protein denaturation. If you know this, what you would do is do what restaurants do, cook them separately and bring them together at the end. They never cook these things together, right? So therefore, this is the protein denaturation. Now, the other thing that happens, particularly in the context of eating meat that also has bones in it, is that it's going to have connective tissue, right? So connective tissue is what connects bones to the muscle tissue, right?
Right.
And What happens at a slightly higher temperature, around 70 Celsius or so, after denaturation happens, is that the connective tissue, which is made of collagen, which is another protein, right? Muscle tissue is made of different proteins. Your connective tissue is made of collagen. Collagen breaks down into something called gelatin. The gelatin famous from your cakes and things like that. So gelatin is what is produced. Like many of these things, it's an irreversible reaction. And this reaction is called hydrolysis. Literally, hydrolysis essentially means using water and high heat to break down large molecules into small molecules. That is what literally the term hydrolysis means, right? So these large proteins get broken up into smaller amino acids. Incidentally, most of the reactions happening inside your body are hydrolysis reactions. They are the process of taking larger molecules. By the way, your body hydrolyzes starch into sugar molecules. It hydrolyzes fats into fatty acids. It hydrolyzes proteins into amino acids. That's what's happening all through. But here, in the context of actually cooking, you're trying to hydrolyze only the collagen using high temperature. So what happens there is that gelatin provides a very unctuous mouthfeel, which you would have experienced when you're eating any jelly-based thing, right? So it compensates for the water moisture loss from the denaturation.
Okay.
So getting a perfect textured meat gravy is genuinely hard because you're playing this kind of game. What you want to do is you want to denature the protein and you want to make sure just enough hydrolysis of the collagen happens so that you get the perfect kind of mouthfeel, right? So interesting thing is that if you don't cook it hard enough, your dish will be drier tasting. But if you cook it just past that point, it'll actually be a lot more softer. But if you cook it beyond a certain point, then it'll become dry again. So there's a very narrow window when meat dishes are actually just the perfect texture. Now, for most part in Indian cooking, and like I said before, right, we focus more on the flavorings we add and not on the intrinsic mouthfeel and the texture of the meat itself. Although some people now do want a good mouthfeel when they eat a chicken. It's easier to get kids to eat it if it's not dry and chewy and so on. But what happens here is the fact that we generally don't care. Most Indian restaurants will end up overcooking meat simply because the customers are actually used to that. In fact, they find if it is slightly soft, they will send it back and say it's undercooked. In reality, it's not. It's actually perfectly cooked.
We see the same with, I see this instinctive Indian squeamishness with steak, right? A rare steak or a medium rare, you need that hint of pink in the middle. And then that people immediately start imagining tapeworms and other parasites whenever we see that undercooked meat. And in a tropical country, that fear makes sense.
Understandable. Right. It's understandable. But then you have to realize that, basically the cut of meat is frozen as soon as the animal is butchered, okay? It is staying in a sub-freezing temperature till pretty much the point the guy is taking it and cooking it on your other thing. In fact, the lower the temperature, the only reason you're doing 52 is that you want to kill some bacteria that could be present because the butcher and others did not do a good job, is why the FDA and others will say that you have to cook it at least to 52 Celsius.
Right.
52 Celsius is not very hot at all, by the way. Right? There's very tepid water. So that's the interesting thing about that. So this was hydrolysis, right? So in the context of hydrolysis, there are two things happen. One, most of the hydrolysis is actually happening inside your body. The hydrolysis relevant in the context of cooking is when you actually cook like meat gravies, right? Now, the last reaction obviously is Maillard reaction, which is often the most special one because that's at the heart of flavor in food. Okay? We started out with saying that most flavor in food comes from spices, right? Spices being flavor molecules dissolved in fats. So that's obviously number one. Intrinsically, the other core carbohydrates, proteins, and all these other things don't have any intrinsic flavor per se. Okay? All the rest of stuff is that you have to add. Now, what happens at temperatures above 110 Celsius, though, is that anything that has both proteins and carbohydrates, basically sugars and amino acids, above 110 Celsius, these react to produce a family of astonishingly aromatic molecules that really improve the taste of anything. And by the way, the Maillard reaction can only happen in something that has both sugars as well as carbohydrates as well as protein, which is why, by the way, you can't deep fry, for example, a raw piece of meat because there's not enough sugars. Raw piece of meat is just mostly protein, protein and fat. There are no carbohydrates. That is why you have to use a batter. Anything that does not have enough carbohydrates need to be dipped into a batter. So it could be
breading,
breading, right? So most vegetables also that you're trying to make a pakoda don't have enough proteins, or either don't have enough proteins or either don't have enough sugars for enough Maillard reaction to happen, which is why you need to dip them into a batter of some kind before you fry them. And batter is basically starch. Okay. So that's the reason why you need, so Maillard reaction happens at 110 and above when basically food starts to brown and carries on all the way till about 170, after which the output of those reactions are not very healthy. Produce some carcinogenic stuff, slightly burnt stuff, right? So it's getting into burning territory. Between 110 and 170 is the family of these very complex reactions, which, by the way, we are still documenting because it's just a lot of this stuff is just very, very complicated. But we kind of know that there are these families of molecules that provide various kinds of aromas, a slightly caramelly flavor, a meaty and savory flavor, sulfurous kinds of flavors, and all these other smells that you kind of instinctively associate with Maillard reactions, right? The baking of bread. The smell of a bakery is the smell of the Maillard reaction. The smell of frying pakoda, smell of frying is the smell of the Maillard reaction. The smell of meat grilling is the smell of the Maillard reaction, and so on. Potatoes frying. Every one of the potatoes actually have brown very well because they have enough protein and sugars. Okay. That's why you can actually brown potatoes. But it's much harder to brown much higher starch tubers that don't have enough protein, like your colocasia and others. Sometimes we will add rice flour and other things and other basin and other things that have protein, in fact, to get them to brown and so on. Right?
So here the fat is serving as just a vehicle to safely heat these ingredients at whatever, above 100 degrees? Is that the purpose?
Exactly. So here's the thing. Non-intuitively, fat in the context of frying or in the context of the Maillard reaction, anything, right? In the context of pan frying, sauteing, whatever it is, right? Is serving the same role that water is serving at lower temperatures as a medium for transfer of heat, even transfer of heat. That's primarily the thing. Why do we cook in water? Simply because, you put things into a pan, some parts of the food are touching the hot metal and some parts are not. So you're going to have uneven cooking. The only reason we cook in water is so that the heat is applied all over, because water will, liquid convection, and it will transfer the heat to the food evenly. But the limitation of water is that it can't go above 100 Celsius, because after which it boils. Right? Then you don't have enough water left. So the reason we use fats as a cooking medium is primarily so that I have a liquid cooking medium that transfers heat evenly to my food above 100 Celsius. And since most fats tend to sort of, refined oil and all that, have a smoke point of, 220 Celsius, they're completely they're not going to burn in the temperature range that you're cooking. Fats do not chemically react with your food. That's the thing. There is no chemical reaction happening with the fats at all.
They might get absorbed.
Yeah, I mean, you're eating them. Yeah, they're getting absorbed, right? They're getting stuck to the food and all that. You're consuming the fat. Don't worry about it. And then your liver and all the rest of these things are, breaking it down ultimately and so on. But by the way, so think about it, right? We are mostly water, right? Our entire digestive tract, entire premise of cooking, entire premise of all of this is very centered around water. And fats don't mix with water. So, interesting question is that actually, how do your fats travel down, right? If you're all water and the entire thing, all these reactions are predicated on water, how do actually fats travel? They travel by emulsification.
Okay.
So when you agitate, so what happens is that one way to get water to mix with fat is to emulsify it. Right? Emulsify meaning that you're mechanically agitating it so that you have like water and fat molecules sort of, interspersed with each other, but not necessarily sort of, bonding with each other and so on.
Milk being the best natural example of this.
Yeah, milk, yogurt, all these are natural examples. However, if there is an emulsifying agent, right? So emulsifying agent is any molecule that has a water-friendly end and a water-unfriendly end. So that will actually make the emulsion really strong. So we use bile as the emulsifying agent.
Okay.
The thing that what you vomit out, right? So the nasty thing, that is the emulsifying agent for all the fats that you eat. Okay? So your fats literally turn into something like mayonnaise all through till it gets to the small intestine, at which point they're broken down into fatty acids. Right? So that's the only way. Otherwise, if it's hydrophobic, it's going to be tough to deal with, given the fact that there's water everywhere.
Which is why we can't just drink oil.
Yeah, you can't. You can, except that it's tough to, kind of force it in, right?
Yeah, and the body doesn't like it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, correct. It's a big struggle, right? Till it gets to your stomach and then it'll get emulsified with the bile and then it'll ultimately go in, right? And it's also why, your, on the other hand, emulsions like butter are easier to eat. You can eat butter. Right? So especially the soft, creamy butter, white butter, that you get from fresh cream is not hard to eat, but just oil is hard to eat. And mayonnaise is relatively easy to eat because it's a fat water emulsion.
Thank you so much, Ashok. So let's take another quick break and we'll come back And I want to talk to you. I want to go back to a little bit of economics because that's underpins a lot of different things on this show. And I think there's a lot of economics to cooking and also home cooking, right? And I think a significant part of your book, while you also explore, adventurous techniques and, the underpinnings of how to make food flavorful rather than just nutritious. You also talk about, how to think about quick fixes and, doing things efficiently as well.
What are some of the radical changes that are now shaping our workspace? With physical distancing and heightened safety protocols being the norm, will technology finally make its large-scale entry to the workspace? Will design as we know it change for the long term? Is it possible for the Indian commercial real estate space to adopt a 360-degree approach to sustainability? Join our hosts at the Future of Space podcast by RMZ as we deliberate with industry leaders, analysts, and bright young minds on the way forward for the workspace given the new COVID normal. Tune in to the IVM Podcasts app or wherever you stream your favorite podcasts.
Hi and welcome back. I'm here with Krish Ashok and we're talking about food science in India. We're talking about his fantastic new book, Masala Lab. So, Ashok, I want to talk to you about a little bit of economics, right? So now, the famous thing that I sort of heard about and then read more about was in Singapore, how Lee Kuan Yew, one of his big pushes, this great sort of Asian-style socialist sort of diktats on society was saying, look, it's unproductive for people to cook at home because it's not, labor's not used efficiently. Why are you cooking for just one person? So, you know what? I want everyone to be in the workplace. I want the economy to be productive. So that's why he sort of famously started these hawker centers where good food that can be eaten daily can be available at an affordable cost outside the house, right? So then, if you can manage sort of child raising work, pretty much food is not something that's any more in the equation. India seems to be the opposite, right? I mean, at least till recently, maybe Swiggy is changing it. And, I'm actually curious to learn from our listeners on, how often they might be ordering in from Swiggy, Zomato, any of these services. But until recently, this was for eating out, right? It was for a special occasion. And that's why I think the restaurant cuisine in India is also overspiced, over-salted, over everything, because you want it to be extra tasty because it's supposed to be a delicacy. And as a result, it's not healthy either. But coming back to home, I see that you have a reverse, right? You have mothers, grandmothers, and others who toil away in the kitchen for an inordinate amount of time. If you're making chapatis, I mean, forget about it. And, you ferment something over 6 hours or a day. You have this elaborate sort of supply chain and process chain of your own that's within an Indian kitchen, right? And a lot of that does not make a whole lot of sense today, or it feels problematic, right? I mean, why should somebody be doing unpaid labor of that extent today? So can you tell us a little bit about how we can think about unit economics in the kitchen, where I'm guessing that the biggest cost is time rather than anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. I think spot on, right? So this has always been quite fascinating for me, right? On the one hand, when I was young and I went to the US for the first time and I started eating American food, and I started thinking that, look at the sophistication of the cuisine in India, the level of the diversity, the tastes, and the amount of time that seems to go. And I can see in the canteen that the guy is literally taking a piece of meat and just, slathering in some things, and in like 2 minutes, the whole thing is ready. How is this such an advanced society and they have such a terrible cuisine? That was obviously my views have evolved over time. But I think the elephant in the room is obviously the fact that this is a society that has largely decided to outsource cooking to unpaid labor of women, right? I mean, essentially, and we've, in some sense, it's sort of reaffirmed by a very patriarchal preference for only fresh cooked food, right? And it's kind of also become part of the whole, specifically, at least in the caste system that we have. Brahmins, for example, they're like, ritualistically, they're not supposed to eat older food, and there's like specific rules of only this has to be cooked in this precise way. And so there's always been a tendency, if you will, of a lot of those traditions trying to push back on modernity over time. But this is not today's issue, right? I mean, this has been a long history of this modernization, I would argue, for the last perhaps even 100 years, right? Ever since perhaps, I guess the British might have introduced modern cooking appliances, gas stoves or for that matter. I've met old people who say that food cooked on wood-fired things where the woman will die from lung cancer at the age of 50 is better than food cooked on a gas flame. And there are people who kind of swear by that. It's possible, yes. I mean, if you cook on a gas flame, yes, the wood, when it burns, produces none of these very flavorful compounds that do get into your food. That's why wood-smoked food or smoky flavors are there. Yes, that is true. But at the end of the day...
Or why barbecue is a thing unto itself.
Yeah, barbecues and so on. But at what cost, right? I mean, the fact that, you're keeping half of the population literally in the kitchen for hours and hours together. So it's been an interesting journey. So if you think about, in my own case, I think back on the first time we got a refrigerator, for example, right? It was in the mid-80s. I mean, I was in Bangalore then. And for the first few years, my mother was using the refrigerator only for milk and curd and nothing else. She only then realized that, she could actually make her dosa batter go slightly longer by putting it in the fridge. The entire process of thinking about batter and fermentation rates is predicated entirely on room temperature. Right? All the history knowledge that we have is based on room temperature. So people intuitively, but they kind of intuitively know, Tamil people living in Bangalore know that fermentation is slower in Bangalore because it's a colder climate. Beyond that, nobody really thought that, I could largely stall it inside the fridge and actually keep that batter going for much longer. And therefore, I could actually make more batter up front. So therefore, I actually have less effort over time, right? So, I'm able to optimize my time further, right? So the sense that it's over time, but now my mother absolutely, makes giant amounts of batter and has increasingly bought bigger and bigger fridges and so on. So the use of the refrigerator clearly has been one tremendous help in terms of really reducing the time that you spend in the kitchen, because you can then kind of prep things up front and then put it inside. You can control the rates of fermentation and things like that, right? So this is not just with fridges and stuffs. It's with almost all other kinds of shortcuts and techniques, right? One interesting thing that I've often found is the fact that we don't use the freezer as much, right? And it is a pity, right? We have learned to use the refrigerator reasonably well now. Most houses now really have a completely packed refrigerator. It is now more common for people to make larger amounts and store leftovers. Trust me, when I was growing up, there was no concept of leftovers. Food was always freshly cooked, right? And people, uncles, these random old Uncle G's used to say, in my house, there is no leftovers. We cook everything fresh. You aren't cooking anything. Your wife is doing all of the cooking and you're just sitting and sort of, talking here. But the interesting thing is that people have not somehow realized that a freezer is an opportunity to extend things even well beyond just the 2 or 3 days that you could extend in the regular temperature of the fridge, which is 6 degrees, at which point biological activity is slow but not stopped. Right. Give enough time and fungus and bacteria will act at 6 Celsius, right? But at minus 13 or minus 14, much, much harder. Literally no activity happens as long as you don't have a power cut. So, your things are largely safe. The use of the freezer, for example, allows you to prepare things ahead of time, allow you to prepare parts of meals and refrigerate them, right? So in a sense that I think I often find that there's an interesting, I remember reading somewhere that when Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist, when he was at Princeton, he's still studying economics, right? The urban legend is that he wrote a paper during his time at Princeton about how there's a correlation between the sophistication of a country's or a part of the world's cuisine and the level of egalitarianism in the society. That the more equal a society, the worse the food. Okay? So it basically takes England as an example of the fact that, look, it was the first country where basically men and women both started working well before any other part of the world. And when both men and women work, you definitely want to ultimately move towards a kind of cooking that is utilitarian, practical, canned foods, prepped foods. You quickly are able to sort of put together a meal and so on. So a lot of English food and the criticism it gets comes from the fact that it is a functional cuisine aimed at feeding and not necessarily for tasting. And it's aimed, it happened over a 200-year period when men and women were both working, right? On the other hand, a cuisine like Indian cuisine, Mughlai or Maharaja and all these Nawabi cuisines and all, is predicated on the fact you either have women or you have servants, okay,
right,
who are able to literally cook for you. So there is a basic foundational this thing that you're going to have. If you're rich enough to the point, or you can underpay someone because of the caste system and other things to cook for you, then you can have a really sophisticated cuisine and so on. And then you can insist that that's the only thing you're doing. And so I'm not interested in shortcuts. I'm not going to get you a mixie. I'm not going to get you a so on because I want it hand cut, right? My grandfather would say that chutney made in the, in this granite stone is tastier than chutney made in a mixie and so on. Yes, there is some science behind it. It's because the granite stone is going to break your cells along the natural cell divisions, as opposed to a high-speed mixie. It's going to damage a lot more cells and also end up heating the food and cooking it. So it's going to lose a lot more aroma. Yes, in that sense, yes. But it's how impractical is it to start to make dosa or chutney in a granite stone nowadays, right? So in that sense, there is this, right? And then there is this other element of how sometimes we Indians have a tendency to not value their time as much, in the sense that people don't realize that you actually save a lot more time if you make large batches of preparatory ingredients and freeze them. This is what restaurants do, by the way. As much as you're eating on Swiggy, a ton of the food you're eating was not cooked from fresh. Let's remember that. Pieces of that, elements of that food, the core makhani gravy, the core, onion gravy, yellow gravy, or whatever it is, the spice mixes and all of that was all prepared ahead of time. In some cases, it was prepared that early morning, but in many cases, it was prepared days ahead and frozen. That's just that. I think, understanding that industrialization and applying it in the home kitchen has tremendous advantages.
People have started doing some of this on their own, right? It's not like, anyone with agency and with some resources at their disposal have started doing it. But unfortunately, this has still sort of stayed at the level of tribal knowledge, right? And by tribal knowledge, I just mean that, it's you largely hear and learn by hearsay. You see a friend, a sister, a brother, somebody doing it, and then they vouch for it, so you learn it. And unfortunately, it's not spread in much larger ways, right? Also, perhaps because so many of our cuisines are so, just like our society is so endogamous, our cuisines therefore also become very endogamous in that nature, right? They become micro cuisines that are specific to one household and one sub-community and so on. So the transfer of knowledge across these becomes weaker.
Yeah. So it's quite fascinating. So every time you look at YouTube comments and you look at even, personally, when I put out these cooking videos on Twitter, right? So there are two categories of reactions. One is obviously, hey, love this, I'm going to try this and so on. The second category of comment, and this is more common on the internet widely, at least on YouTube comments, there'll always be some guy, and this is usually guys, who will say, this is not how you make this dish, which is a patently silly thing to say, right? No two houses make this dish the same way. And again, that person's logic will typically be, I am from this region, so I know this better. Chances are he probably doesn't cook. He probably has watched his mother cook or his grandmother cook or some women in his house cook. But he has determined that this dish should not have mustard, should not have this particular ingredient added, because that somehow violates this entire thing. And I think it takes away from the fact that cooking is foundationally utilitarian, right? A cook essentially looks at what you have in the fridge, right? And you look at what you have, and then you make the best of what you have. That's almost always how cooking has always been, right? All of a sudden, now you're looking up a recipe on the internet and it has an ingredient list of 15 things. And you now assuming that if you don't have 2 of those ingredients, you can't make this dish, which is patently silly. You should be able to replace. If you understand the basic foundations of food science, you should be able to find some replacements, right? For example, if something calls for, say, coconut vinegar, a go-and dish calls for coconut vinegar, making some vindaloo, right? You can use apple cider vinegar. It's not going to kill you. It'll still taste pretty good. You can use regular white vinegar too. Actually, you know what? If you don't have vinegar, actually, you can use tamarind too. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the role of the vinegar is that of an acid. Yes, coconut vinegar does add some complex flavors, which will result in a really good taste and all of that. But it doesn't matter, right? There are so many things here. There are a million ways to make an Indian dish tasty. And I think people sometimes get completely stuck up simply because, as I keep saying in the book, that your experience of food is related to your personal nostalgia. That's all. And you want to then fiercely defend your personal nostalgia and prevent other people from cooking something in a slightly different way. And that's really what it is. You're right? Indian cooking is a million different micro cuisines. And people sometimes have this notion that their method that they just happen to use is the only single way to make a dish. It's a very common fallacy, particularly on the internet.
Absolutely. And coming back to the innovations, one of the other drivers that potentially have tried to change things in the recent past is also Indians going abroad, right? For example, even to this day, it's trivial for an Indian living in any city with an Indian store in the US to get grated coconut that is frozen. Exactly. You still don't find that in Bangalore. I don't know if you find it in Chennai. And It's a ridiculous thing to be able to freshly shave a coconut every time you want to use this much of it, a pinch.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous.
Exactly. Yeah, and coconuts are notorious, right? Because I think the moment you cut it, right, it starts spoiling pretty quickly. Okay, and refrigeration dehydrates it, and it just makes it. Here's the thing, right? The problem with the coconut is that once you cut it, you're going to have to try and figure out a way to use all of it, right? Of course, now people have realized that, hey, you know what? You can freeze it, and that way actually you can grate it. You can grate all of it, use what you want, but refrigerate or freeze it, and to really extend its shelf life, right? So that it doesn't lose its aroma and that taste and all of that, right? It doesn't go bad, stale.
Right, but that entire process can be eliminated from the kitchen. Why should you break a coconut, break, and then freeze? That ideally should not be there.
Right, absolutely, right. So there are two things to this. So one is that this Indian obsession with fresh ingredients and the natural, therefore, concomitant mistrust of anything that is prepackaged purely for convenience. Of course, to be honest, I think it's significantly more common. If I go to the neighborhood grocery store here, the guy now has pre-cut sambar vegetables packet is there, which means that it has like 2 drumsticks and some carrots and some other things. Or for one family, you want to make sambar, rather than deal with the complexity of buying drumsticks, carrots, and then you're storing the rest in the fridge, etc., you can just buy this, right? Clearly, some other things like sprouted legumes, right? Sprouted moong and all. You have to spend 2-3 days, babysit it, prevent fungus from happening, prevent it from dying and all that. So in few cases, these are coming. But to be honest, there's still a ton of convenience that I think needs to start happening. And people need to get out of this mindset that somehow something that you buy there is not fresh and so on, right? So here's the other fascinating common misconception. Okay? Frozen vegetables are actually almost always fresher than fresh vegetables if you are in a city.
Okay.
And this is true because frozen vegetables were frozen pretty soon after the vegetable was harvested, because that's how the whole supply chain works. Okay? And they've stayed frozen all through that way. Otherwise, they would rot. Okay. Fresh vegetables, on the other hand, stayed at room temperature for days. They sat in a warehouse. They sat in trucks. And unless you're in a village where your vegetable was grown next door, you're getting a vegetable that was grown months before, right? Sometimes weeks or months before, right? It is by no means fresher than a frozen vegetable, which incidentally, as long as you've stopped biological activity, I would consider that the frozen vegetable is technically literally minutes or say hours from when it was harvested, whereas the vegetable you actually buy from the store is weeks old and weeks stale. So, but people still think that frozen vegetables are not fresh, or they have a frozen smell, etc. Boss, that you can fix that's because the water that you're using to freeze is etc. That has other quality of issues, and the water in which the vegetable itself was grown is not great. It probably had other things and all of that, right? You can address that by cooking. You can address that by washing. You can address that by adding acids. You can do all those other things, right? You can wash it in vinegar and do all those other things, right? But once you actually cook, anything you take out of a freezer will have that natural smell, but it'll go away once you cook it. There's going to be no difference at all. I think people still have that misconception. The moment you kind of realize this and you value your time more, I think there's a ton of things that you can actually optimize here.
So, Ashok, thank you so much for joining me on the Pragati podcast. And thank you for, I enjoyed being able to read your book ahead of publication and we are recording this about a month and a little more before the release. I can't wait for the book to come out. And thank you again for joining me on the show.
Thank you. Absolutely lovely. And hope your audience enjoys the book.
I hope so too. And I hope people become more intelligent cooks, those who are first-time cooks. And hopefully your book doesn't lead to more mansplaining by Indian men. That I fear is perhaps the biggest risk of your book.
You know, when I first wrote the book and I first wrote the introductory chapter of the book, and I sent it to a couple of friends, just read the introduction and see if it's kind of making sense. One of the feedback I got from some of my women friends was the fact that, boss, most women who are cooking in India are not cooking because they love cooking, because they're forced to cook, right? They're not going to sit and analyze what flavor molecule is in lemongrass versus pepper so that they kind of go well together. They're just trying to feed a family, right? So make sure that this doesn't become some kind of artisanal, forcing someone to enjoy something that's actually a laborious chore, right? So in the sense that I think, upfront, so it actually changed my way of writing so that I said that, look, I can't just target only the novice or someone who loves cooking. There's got to be something in it for someone who thinks cooking is a chore and wants to optimize it. In fact, a ton of the other shortcuts and these other things that I focused on, the economic and the time aspect of it, came about as a result of this kind of feedback. And I call it out right up in the introduction itself that please do not use this knowledge to explain to people who are great cooks that they're actually doing things wrong. I think it's this famous guy who wrote this Bible on food science. I forget his name. So he's the one who actually said that, look, in the kitchen, it's the cooking knowledge that counts, not the knowledge of food science. Food scientists understand science and all of that. But in the kitchen, it's the knowledge of cooking that counts. And we've been doing it for thousands of years, right? So don't use some newfound technical knowledge to try and explain why someone is doing something wrong. Because in most cases, they're doing the right thing to produce the right kind of outcomes, but they may not be able to explain the science of it. So I think that's the spirit in which I think people should take this.
So, good cooks in India are the best engineers. And the food science can just give us an introduction and hopefully allow us to become good engineers as well, rather than dismiss anything else.
Honestly speaking, the cooking is your easiest opportunity to apply, to really see applied science in action, right? In the sense of your physics, chemistry, whatever you learn at school. If in some sense you also learn to cook, I think it's a good way to understand many things you appreciate: evaporation, boiling point of water, the fact that, let's say you cook at a higher altitude, say in Shimla, water will boil sooner, right? All of those, you kind of read in school, right? The elevation of boiling point, depression of boiling point and all that, but it's never brought to life, right? And you kind of realize that when you actually go and you experience it in real life and you understand cooking, what happens when proteins are denatured and so on. So I think it's a good way to see applied science in action. So that's all.
Thank you so much, Ashok. And dear listeners, go ahead and buy that book right now. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.
जिंदगी डायरीज के पन्नों में कुछ पुरानी यादें, समुंदर किनारे झूमते दरख्त, जवां दिल की धड़कनें और अनजान मुलाकातें हैं। तो आइए खोलिए मेरे साथ जिंदगी डायरी के पन्ने और साथ ही खुलकर जीते हैं जिंदगी। आप सुन सकते हैं जिंदगी डायरीज IVM पॉडकास्ट ऐप या वेबसाइट पर, या जहां कहीं से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो।